Hello, croeso mawr, a very warm welcome to a very special event this afternoon on the poets Owen Sheers and Seamus Heaney. My name is Francesca Rhydderch. I'm Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Swansea University, and I'm going to be chairing the conversation today and welcoming your questions. We can see plenty have been coming through so far, and we hope to see a few more by the end of the session. So this is an event that's organised by the Wales and the World project at Swansea University, which is funded by HEFCW and led by the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing with CREW, the Centre for Research into the Literature and Languages of Wales, and the Cultural Institute. And the idea of a discussion of fieldwork by Seamus Heaney and Skirrid Hill by Owen Sheers came from Jen Dyson and her literature students at Ysgol y Pant. We would love to receive more suggestions from teachers and students for future events, and so please do fill in the short questionnaire that you will receive at the end of this event to let us know about what you'd like to see us discussing in the future. You can also find podcasts, a recording of this event and other material for schools on our website, and we'll be putting that into the chats as we go through the event today, including free creative writing workshops and the next event, which is tomorrow evening and is focused on historical fiction. So as I said at the beginning, we do have a Q&A facility, which hopefully you can all access as part of this event. So please feel free, as we're beginning the conversation and going through the conversation, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A, and we hope to cover all of them before the end of the session today. So before we get started, I'd just like to say a little bit about my two colleagues who are here with me today to talk about the work of Seamus Heaney, and Owen, who is here to tell us a little bit about his own work. And we're absolutely delighted to have both of you with us here today and looking forward to a lively session. Now, you should all have the flyer for this event, which gives you an indication of just how prolific both Richard and Owen are as writers and critics. And so I won't read out all of that information for you, but I think it would be, quite an idea for you to go and have a look at the flyer, at the many publications that they've published. Owen isn't just a poet, he's a playwright, he's a novelist, he's written non-fiction, and Richard, who's my colleague in the English department at Swansea University, has written a great deal about modernism and is very strong on Irish studies, and is the ideal person, I think, actually to be with us talking about Seamus Heaney today. So a very warm welcome to you both. So just to get started on the conversation and just to get us thinking about, why are we here today? Why do we think it would be a good idea to talk about Seamus Heaney and Owen's work, both being on the A-level syllabus, and how interesting a conjunction they are when you bring them together? I just wonder if I could ask you both a couple of very general questions to get the conversation going. If I could start with you, Richard. Could you perhaps just talk a little to the idea of, why do we need to be reading Seamus Heaney today? What do you think he brings to a contemporary audience, and particularly to perhaps a younger audience who are reading poetry perhaps for the first time?
Yes, of course, and thanks for welcoming me on into this event, and it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Well, Heaney died in 2013, and Fieldwork, the A-level text, was published in the late 1970s. So in that sense, the poet and the work are in the past. It may feel like quite a long time ago, the 1970s, but it's pressingly topical. And I've long been interested in the question of borders, Central European borders, also Irish borders, and it's 100 years ago that the border was drawn across the island of Ireland. Ireland was partitioned, 1921-22. Exactly 100 years ago. And I was looking at Heaney's Nobel acceptance speech. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the mid-90s, and a year after a ceasefire was declared, he gave a speech to the Nobel committee and audience in Stockholm, and he was thinking about that border across Ireland. It was still a border, checkpoints, barbed wire, and he was hoping that that border could become like a net on the tennis court, allowing a kind of agile back and forth, he put it. And he got, his hopes were kind of fulfilled, weren't they? Because we've had a long period of peace on that border. But now in 2021, 100 years after the drawing of the border, we're more aware of it. The economic border, is it going to disappear into the Irish Sea? Petrol bombs are being thrown over Belfast city lines, that sort of thing. Something happened last night, didn't it? I suppose this tells us that if we willfully forget history or deny its realities, it will return, its spectres will walk again. So you read a book like Fieldwork with all its elegies for people who died, some of them in the sectarian violence in the 70s. You read that not with the sense that history is safely tucked away, but that it's making itself, it threatens to make itself present again in violent ways. So he teaches us that, and just quickly to finish up, that's a bit doom laden, isn't it? But we'll probably have time to talk about the frontier of writing a bit later. That's a phrase of one of Heaney's lectures, frontiers writing. That there is behind this difficulty, this suffering, an affirmative belief in his art, in his poetry, in language, which sustained Heaney throughout his life. And he thinks of an elsewhere beyond the frontier of writing, where, as he puts it, he's quoting the American poet Wallace Stevens, the imagination presses back against the pressure of reality. So we have this more affirmative, hopeful idea that poetry, the independence of the imagination, if you like, can be a kind of counterweight, a counterforce to the suffering and to often violent, brutal realities of the present time of history. And he says, I think it's in the it's in his Redress of Poetry book, that the frontier is there for the crossing. So he does give us this hope that the frontier is there for the crossing as an artist, and that's something that he allows us to kind of balance the practical and the poetic, the realities of history and the power of the imagination.
It's a fascinating concept across both volumes, isn't it? This idea of borders and separation. And Owen, in some ways, you're a border writer too, aren't you? And certainly that this sense of borders is very important in Skirrid Hill, the collection of poems that we're talking about today. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that to begin with. Was that one of the central concepts of the book for you when you started writing, or did it grow as the poems came together?
Well, first of all, hello. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you so much, Jen and her classmates, for coming up with this fantastic idea. Yes, obviously, the question of borders and the concept of a border, both as a meeting place, but also as a line of separation, very much runs through Skirrid Hill. In fact, the way that the poems are ordered are sort of either side of a border of two poems that very much live either side of, I hope, two sort of sequences that approach the world differently, and are both titled in two different languages. But all of that really came after the writing of the individual poems. I think, one of the thrills, one of the beauties of writing lyric poetry is that the work will quite often reveal your themes and your areas of shared territory back to you. And certainly what I find is that when you're engaged in writing an individual poem, it's trying to be true to the motivational truth of that poem, which is really engaging you. You're concentrated right on that leading edge of language. You're trying to make each word work for its place in the line, as the poet Keith Douglas would say. So with Skirrid Hill, it was really when I stepped back and I looked across these poems that I guess had been written over a period of about 8 or 9 years, that I became aware that so many of them had their genesis, had their starting point with an awareness of various kinds of separation, be that between two people or across a cultural border or a language, or as there is in a few of the poems there, between being a child and growing up. And I suppose, to come back to Heaney, and it was lovely to hear Richard speak of it, actually. I was just listening to the news recently whilst going back through the poems of Fieldwork, and was struck by how tragically current so many of those poems have recently become because of recent events. But also, I suppose that returning to those poems, I was reminded that we also return to Heaney for everything that isn't linked to a certain time or that doesn't age, and that's his craft and the nature of his craft that manages to blend this extraordinary accessibility. You know, the doors of his poems are open for the reader, and yet when you step through, at the risk of extending this metaphor, there are many rooms. You know, so he manages to combine that clarity and that depth. So yeah, that's certainly one of the reasons why I'm still reading Heaney.
I mean, it's one of the things that we were discussing as well, thinking about this event, isn't it, Richard? You were talking about many of the poems being about the process of writing poetry as much as being poems in themselves.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we have, for instance, the Glanmore sonnets, and yeah, reading between the volumes, I think, you know, Owen often sort of thinks about nature and writing together. I think the swallows are italic, for example, and you get that with Heaney, the early Glanmore sonnets, very memorable. Well, memorable because he uses the phrase "opened ground," which is the title chosen for one of the big collections, Opened Ground. But the first of the Glanmore sonnets begins, "Vowels ploughed into other, opened ground." And then again, it comes back to that line at the end of the second sonnet of the Glanmore sequence, "Vowels ploughed into other, opened ground." Slight syntactical difference. We move from a colon to a comma. I'll leave you guys to sort of figure out that. But then, yeah, "Vowels ploughed into other, opened ground, each verse returning like the plough turned round." It's very rich, that. You're ploughing your furrow, and you're turning. It's a verse. It turns. That's the Latin verse. It's turning again. It's ploughing through the earth. Those vowels, vowel and plough, there's a sort of assonance there, isn't there? It's certainly not an I rhyme. You see OW and OUGH, but when you speak it out, the plough turned round, the vowels plough into others. So the lines are actually enacting what's being said as well. Yeah. So writing, ploughing are one and the same. He has another of the sonnets, if you remember, I think it's the fifth one, no, the fourth one, where it's a memory of living quite close to a railway line, and as a child putting his ear to the line. So the first line is, "I used to lie with an ear to the line." Now that's a memory of being, you know, doing that. Oh, can I hear the iron twang or whatever it is, the iron, what's he called, the iron tune? Can I hear it? But it's also, I'm going to be a poet, and I'm listening to the line. I'm ploughing the line, or I'm listening to the line. So it's that acoustic effect of how one line turns into other. Yeah, that's an example of, yeah, thinking about the, you know, art, memory, imagination coming together. Poems which may be about nature, often are, but are also about kind of writing nature, about writing about the writing of nature as well. Yeah.
There's such a sort of rich simplicity there, isn't there? It just goes to show that, you know, poetry doesn't have to be difficult and knotted back on itself and hard to comprehend and having to be unpacked. It can sing off the line, can't it? But so clearly and simply. I think that, you know, that's the power of Heaney for me anyway. And the way that you've been talking about Heaney so far, Owen, you know, he was clearly a great influence on you as a writer, and I just wondered if we could sort of rewind a little bit and go back to your beginnings as a writer and as a poet, because you were quite young when you were, you know, 16 or so when you started writing, you know, the similar age to many of our audience today, and I just wondered if you could rewind and think back to what it was like starting out at that age, and what brought you to poetry, really.
Yes, it all feels like a very long time ago now, but I did start writing quite young, and I think, you know, like all writers, I started wanting to write because I was reading, and because poems, especially these small parcels of language, were, you know, changing my internal weather. They were affecting me, and I guess I wanted to know, you know, how are these poets doing this? You know, how does this work? And if you want to know how something works, the best way to do that is to either do it or to sort of take it apart. So I suppose I started doing both of those things simultaneously. And you're right, I would have been around 15 or 16, I think, when I read my first Seamus Heaney poems. And there's one specifically, a Midterm Break, which I'm sure that lots of the audience know. And I've got a very clear memory of that being one of those early poems where the hairs on the back of my neck just went up and I had a physical reaction. And that last line just sort of, whipped me in the face, as it does. And I got a sense of how a poem can move a great distance across a short space of page, and how, as you're saying, that mix of narrative and story and depth can come together so that the poem returns to you and you return to the poem. And just listening to Richard talk there, I was reminded, I suppose, that when I talk about depth, it's not just depth of meaning, it's also linguistic depth with Heaney. He's informed by so many languages, Anglo-Saxon and Latin, the Irish, the English. And, with influence, I don't think you ever want to look it straight in the face, which I must say is why doing this event is quite strange for me. I've never done an event where I've spoken about Heaney, because in a way, I kind of want to keep it at the edge of my vision. But looking at it straight on for once, I'm aware that, I think probably quite unconsciously through reading those early Heaney poems, I was attracted to phrases and words that would cast more than one shadow, which I think when you're a young poet is quite risky, because you can veer into sort of overly lewd, overly playful wordplay, but that's all part of the education of being a writer. So yeah, he was an important influence. I think being the age I am, it was impossible not to be interested in poetry and not have this sort of twin turbine voices of Hughes and Heaney sort of going on and influencing you. And then actually I should say that I was very lucky in my early 20s. I got the chance to interview Seamus Heaney at R.S. Thomas's memorial. And if there'd been any poet that had been a much more, I guess, obvious influence on me to myself when I was younger, it was R.S. Thomas. He was the poet who I studied at A level. So the first poet where I read as much of his work as I could. And then interviewing Heaney, we sort of revealed through the conversation two interesting points of lineage that we shared. One was that he spoke very passionately about how important R.S. Thomas had been to him when he was a young poet. Specifically, he said, for showing him that he could write about people who were sparse of speech. And I suddenly realised, yes, of course, that's where Heaney and R.S. Thomas speak to each other. But he then went on to talk about Wilfred Owen, the First World War poet, and about how Wilfred Owen was one of those first poets that showed Heaney that it was possible and okay to write about what happens. And looking back, to come back to the start of your question, I think in some ways that was the most important influence for me. Here was Heaney writing about a rural life, his farming relatives. I wasn't brought up on a farm, but my grandfather was a headmaster and a chicken farmer and a sheep farmer, and I lived around farms and farming people. And I think with a very subtle nod, sort of Heaney just let me know that it was okay to observe and to write the stories of the people and the life that I was seeing around me. So yeah, he was an important influence. I think in my 20s, if you'd asked me about him, I probably wouldn't have acknowledged that. It's only now looking back that that I see how significant his influence was.
Well, in a few minutes, I'd like to turn to some. We've got lots and lots of questions, so I will be turning to those fairly soon. But before we do that, I'd just like to come back to what you were saying, Richard, about borders and the different kinds of borders that are being explored in Heaney's poetry in particular. Maybe you could just sort of take us through a few of those points as well. You talked a little bit about the border between life and death as much as anything else, that the border isn't necessarily a sort of physical, concrete thing, but a little bit more abstract, and maybe you could take us through that.
Yes, maybe if I talk about a couple of the elegies in field work, that might take a little while. We could get the text up, but then I don't know whether that would allow Owen to talk about the borders between death and life that are in his collection as well, such as In the Hill Fort, to those two poems, a number of, and also the Border poem as well, the one that's named Border. Owen,
Border Country.
border country, yeah. So there's an early loss in that, isn't there, as well? So yeah, maybe if I talk a little bit about the elegies in Heaney, then I don't know, Owen could talk about some of his elegies.
That's great, and then we'll go to questions then. Great.
Yeah, I just like, I mean, if it's okay, Bethan, we could get a couple of my handouts up, and we could just sort of look at the text, because in sessions like this, it's easy to talk at a general level, isn't it? And I think we want to have a look at some of Heaney's language, Owen's language.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to put them up now.
If we could get that.
Yeah, you won't see it, but I'm going to put it up onto the screen.
But everybody sees it, don't they?
I'm sure some of the students have got copies, obviously, of the text in front of them. But for those of you who haven't, you should be seeing a handout coming up on the screen. There we go. I can see it. Yeah,
I've kind of filleted these, damaged these poems by getting them on the handout, I'm afraid. But it's the best we could do now. Yeah, the third one there's quite long. If we just stop. Where
do you want me to go to?
Strand at Loch Beg. There we go. Yeah. So I don't know whether people, if we've got the text with them, could look for that one. It's page 9, the Strand at Loch Beg, and we're told, I'll just get my copy here, that this is in memory of Colin McCartney. So he's named a cousin of Heaney's, and I'm very interested in the way he moves to the end of this poem. I'll read it out, actually. Why not? I turn because the sweeping of your feet has stopped behind me, to find you on your knees with blood and roadside muck in your hair and eyes, then kneel in front of you in brimming grass and gather up cold handfuls of the dew to wash you, cousin. I dab you clean with moss, fine as the drizzle out of a low cloud. I lift you under the arms and lay you flat. With rushes that shoot green again, I plait green scapulas to wear over your shroud. This is a lake island. It's not where the cousin was shot. That's a roadside killing that is earlier on in the poem. I'm going to come onto this with another of the elegies, rereading Casualty, something perhaps as a practicing poet Owen could talk about as well. It's this mixture of the memory and the imagination. I'll talk more about that with Casualty, but here Heaney wasn't present when his cousin was murdered, so he has to imagine that, but he also remembers times like this when he would be on an early morning walk with his cousin by this lake island in the Strand, a kind of lake beach, if you like. And so he brings, as any elegy does, I suppose, brings somebody back to life, if only for a moment. But he does this by imagining being on this walk with his cousin, but the cousin has been killed, and he doesn't shy away from that, with blood and roadside muck in your hair. So he brings back the recently killed cousin into this scene, but then he washes the cousin. And notice again the way in which this is punctuated. There's I'm sure in your sixth form classes you've done caesuras, when there's a kind of break and interruption in the middle of a line. It's not only that, it's that comma. We have lines running into each other, enjambed, and then we have to wash you, comma, cousin, full stop. The first time that he's been named as cousin, so that relationship, that family relationship, is acknowledged late on in the poem. And the poet goes on to cleanse and anoint. There's this technical word, asperge, that Heaney likes. He asperges his cousin. He lays him flat. It's this kind of ritual. You get the incantatory rhythm, the ritual of the respecting the dead, honouring the dead, and writing the poem. Yeah, that's very powerful, isn't it? But poetry is opened ground. It's always open-ended. Somebody asked a question about poetry as an answer, which I'd like to pick up on later as well. And Heaney may write a poem, but he may edit it, or he may come back to it. And in a later volume called Station Island, he imagines Colin McCartney accusing him. I'll just briefly read this out. This is Heaney doing the voice of his dead cousin in a later poem from the 1980s. Is a kind of answer to this earlier poem. And Colin McCartney says, the Protestant who shot me through the head, I accuse directly, but indirectly, you who now atone perhaps upon this bed for the way you whitewashed ugliness and drew the lovely blinds of the Purgatorio and saccharined my death with morning dew. So it's the poet wondering about the way in which he or she makes capital out of others' suffering. Something bad happens, you transmute it into verse, and then somebody from the dead will accuse you and say, well, you just, you made this saccharin, you sugared this. But of course, that's another act of the poetic imagination. So on we go, on we go. Maybe I'll pause and let Owen speak for a bit, and we could go to the second elegy afterwards.
Thank you, Richard. And Owen, would you like to come in there, maybe talk about, how you see the elegy and how you've used it in your work, and if it is poetry a constant negotiation with the dead as well as the living?
That's a great question, and it was wonderful to hear Richard actually work through, just those few lines of Heaney in such detail, and especially zeroing in on that admixture, that braiding of imagination and memory, because of course that's exactly where poetry works. Hobbes once said that imagination and memory are one and the same thing, and I think that you most feel that when you're in that world of a poem. So Richard kindly mentioned Border Country, and that's an example of that, where I am remembering a relationship with my childhood friend and the places that we played, and then how at a very young age something happened in his life. His father sadly killed himself, which suddenly sort of catapulted him into adulthood far too early. And there's this, I think we'll be talking about questions and answers later, and for me that poses this question about what is left behind when you have to make that jump into adulthood sooner. But in the poem, that's when I have to jump into imagination, when I'm imagining sort of the ghost of this man now, this man's younger self, unable to find his way home. And I think it's the braiding of memory and imagination that quite often makes the effort of an elegy possible, because as you said, every elegy is also some kind of a resurrection and a negotiation with the dead. In terms of Skirrid Hill, I was struck actually when I went back to fieldwork, and I realised that when Heaney published fieldwork, he was 40. When I published Skirrid Hill, I was 30. So the work and the vision is sort of scanning back over two very different decades. The sort of late sonar of poetry. Margaret Atwood said recently, poetry is always late to the party, but it should be. And that affects the works in all sorts of ways. I'm looking back over very different kind of personal, intimate relationships to Heaney, who's writing love poems to his wife, whereas I'm writing through a series of sort of, those kind of early relationships in your life through which you learn yourself and others. But I'm aware that looking back through my 20s, I'm also looking back over a decade where you do naturally become more familiar with death, which is why I chose that epigraph from T.S. Eliot, East Coker, at the start of the collection, which reads, "As we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living." Because again, when I looked back through the poems, I was struck how, be it grandparents, or sadly people your own age, part of growing older, part of living is becoming more acquainted with death. So yes, it is somewhere that the poems quite often travel to in Skirrid. But I think quite naturally so, because that act of writing is an act of resurrection, and although it can be painful to write these poems, there can be something nourishing in them as well. I suppose I'll just finish by saying a few words about the hill fort and a gair, which, as I suggested earlier, I wanted at the centre of the poem, both because they split either side of the languages of those titles, But also, and again, this picks up on the last point that Richard said, where, you know, Heaney has his cousin address him back, because I found myself in that situation in a slightly different way, in that a friend of mine was killed in a car accident, aged 18, and I wrote to his father, and his father wrote back to me an extraordinary letter in which he said, when it gets too much, he goes up onto the hill fort above their farm and he screams into the storm as if he has to find something large enough to match his grief. And I was, you know, and this burned itself into my mind, and I wrote the poem, but of course the poem wasn't wholly mine, and it was part what I'd been told, and it was part imagination. So I sent it to the father and I said, look, I've written this, hopefully it's true in the way that poems are true, which is not wholly true. Is this okay? And he wrote back to me again, the most extraordinary letter, where he said it is, but it isn't the whole truth, because I also go to that same hill fort when I want to remember my son in the best of ways, and I'm feeling grateful for our life together. So that's an interesting example how where the elegy is an act of resurrection in so many ways, and it's never just the poets. It's a kind of writing and a kind of poem that travels, I think, further beyond you than most. And as a last point, even poems about the ends of relationships in a similar way are a kind of elegy as well, I'd say. I'll just throw that one in there at the end.
Thank you, Owen. Well, let's have a look at a couple of questions from the students, shall we, and see what people would like to ask you about. Bethan, could I ask you to read out, there's a question somewhere, isn't there, about Skirrid Hill and Owen having a clear passion for his country. I don't know if you can see that on the list in the Q&A, Bethan.
I can see that, Fran, if you want me to read that one.
That'd be great, thank you, Gareth.
Many of the poems in Skirrid Hill seem to reflect the tension or ambiguity in the concept of Welshness. Like Heaney, it is the land itself which seems to offer the most reliable answers to the questions the poet is asking. To what extent is it possible for a collection written in English to connote the intrinsic values of Wales?
Well, to answer the end of that, I think of that question, I think it's almost impossible to answer a question of that scale, and as you say, in only one of the languages of the country, and not the original deeper language. And that's maybe something more I write about and I address in my first book, the Blue Book, where I write specifically, and at the risk of cliche, I should say, in the history of Anglo-Welsh writing, or Welsh writing in English, about being Welsh but not having the language. You know, so my grandparents and my mother having the language, and my younger brother having the language, but me sort of being this generational hiccup. But to bring it to Skirrid Hill, I think, yeah, the first part of that question is spot on, that it's the physical landscape, and that as a vehicle of physical imagery for the culture, where for me I'm most interested in, and it's never about answers, but in exploring, asking questions and investigating what it means to come from a certain place, what it means to come from a culture as opposed to a nation. I suspect, like many of us, you know, over the last 5-6 years, I've become increasingly more interested in the idea of cultures as opposed to nations. And looking forward, I'm really interested in what the climate and the ecological crisis will do to our idea of countries, and what we own and what actually belongs to all of us. But in Skirrid Hill, I think you used the word ambiguity in there, and I kind of hope it is there. And again, most explicitly, probably in a poem like Flag, which was written as a result of, I've been living out of Wales for a while, studying and working away. While I was away, there was a referendum on devolution. And then I moved back to Wales, and I was doing a reading out in West Wales, and I took a train through Wales, and I just noticed that there were many more instances of the Welsh flag. And I felt in me at one and the same time, sort of blossoming gratitude for that. I loved seeing the Welsh flag everywhere, and also kind of a ringing alarm bell, as I realised that flags are these symbols who, you know, talking about how borders are both a meeting place and they're something that separates people. Well, the same is true of flags. They can either unite people or they can be incredibly divisive. And so I wanted that poem to enter that territory. You're going back to what I was saying earlier about Heaney's linguistic depth. I hope that there are several lines in that poem that can cut both ways, that could either be read as a very positive perception or view of what was happening in Welshness, or a more questioning, a more worried view. So yeah, it's a constant inquiry, and I guess even more so for me now, because now my children are going through Welsh medium education. So I am finally being led by them, you know, back into the same linguistic flow that my grandparents inhabited, and I have found myself writing about that a lot more recently.
And it's interesting as well, isn't it, that, you know, the nature of Wales itself has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And so when we talk about the languages and cultures of Wales, I feel increasingly we're not just talking about Welsh or English, but many other languages and other cultures. And you know, there's a huge burst of literary activity, grassroots writing among the younger generations, which is changing the whole landscape of Wales all over again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and wonderfully so, you know, and vibrantly so. I've only been recently introduced to a fantastic group of Somali poets in Cardiff, and yeah, and you can feel, and also Jaffrin, the Bangladeshi Welsh writer, and these are people, you know, these are writers who feel Welsh but are also drawing upon other cultural backgrounds, and it's incredibly exciting. And you know, I sort of wish that I'd been a young writer cutting my teeth when I was aware of the same thing happening. Maybe it was, but to be honest, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't made obvious, you know, 15, 20 years ago. But yeah, it's fantastic that it is now.
I think the question you meant, Fran, is the next one, isn't it? The question from Crynion for Sheers is, studying your poetry, Skirrid Hill, we see a clear passion for your country and the landscape that surrounds you. Was it a particular poem that arose a passion for you to start writing about your identity and country, whether it be by Heaney and Fieldwork or other poets?
It's a good question, but looking back, you know, the honest answer is that I think, as I said earlier, what Heaney made me feel was allowable or gave me license to, and other poets, I should say, other, you know, Welsh poets like Gwyneth Lewis, Menna Elfyn, Paul Henry, Robert Mahinick, was that it was, you know, you were allowed to draw from your immediate, you know, locale, and that's both in terms of imagery and vocabulary. But there was also a pressure to speak, I suppose. And again, this was probably due to a lack of my own reading at the time. But what I remember most strongly is feeling that a lot of the people who I lived with, who I saw moving through their lives in school and around me, I didn't see their lives represented in the poetry that I was reading. And as I say, I probably wasn't reading further enough. So there was an early pressure or an early desire to try to render experience in poems that I hadn't seen elsewhere. And again, that's probably more evident in the first book, the Blue Book. So there was no specific poem that thought, I'm going to write about, you know, being brought up in Wales and being Welsh and identity. It was more that was the nature of my life. That's what was around me. And, you know, at the absolute base level, that's what so much of lyric poetry is about. It's about writing about what it means to be alive, and all of the questions that come therein.
Thank you, Owen. And there's another question that I thought actually both of you might be able to answer, so I'll address it to Richard first, thinking about Heaney. The question is for Owen. Many of your poems, like Heaney's, deal with the search for answers. Do you ever arrive at answers through writing poetry? So before I get Owen to answer that question, perhaps you could say a little bit about Heaney and his search for answers, Richard, just to give us a little bit of context.
Yes, I'd be pleased to. When that question came through, it was interesting to me because Heaney actually uses the word answer in his Redress of Poetry book, which, excuse me, I've got it here.
In your study, you seem to have all the books you need literally at your feet, Richard.
Yes. Now I'll just have to. Yeah. It's. Oh, that's right. Yes. He quotes Robert Pinsky. I'll just read this out because it's got the word answer in. An artist, and he quotes it approvingly. An artist needs not so much an audience as to feel a need to answer, a promise to respond. The response may be a contradiction. It may be unwanted. It may go unheeded, but it is owed. So this response is owed, and the sense that it is owed is a basic requirement for the poet's good feeling about his art. So Heaney, he approves Pinsky's idea that the poem art is a need to answer, but he goes on to kind of think about that word in its Ulster context, its colloquial Ulster sense of the word. If you say in Northern Ireland that a thing answers, it means that it's up to the mark, fit for the job, that has passed itself. So he wants the poem to be an answer in that it kind of, it's up to the job, it's strong enough, he thinks. Again, he's quoting the Greek poet Sepphoris there. A poem is strong enough to resist reality, to answer reality. That's, and it can achieve, and I'm quoting Heaney here, a moment of it can reach a moment of achieved grace between people with different allegiances, a momentary stay against confusion. So he takes that word answer, poetry, as an answer to the problems of his divided culture. But of course, we've got to think of keeping the question open. And at the a casualty of the other elegy, we don't need to get it up now, but it's about questions as well. That the man who died in the bombing would ask Heaney, the poet, puzzle me the right answer to that one. So there's a kind of, even though this man, Lewis O'Neill, isn't a poet, he goes around the pubs, he likes fishing, he's a clever man, but not necessarily educated. Now you're an educated man, puzzle me that one. So poet, you're meant to answer the question, mate. You know, this is a pub conversation. And then, you know, Heaney revisits his death. He takes his imagination all the way to the pub, a scene he couldn't possibly have observed because he would have been blown up. He imagines that. He imagines going out fishing again with this man. And what's the last line of the poem, Casualty? Question me again. He's asking the revenant, the ghost, he's asking the dead man to question him. So poetry is an answer. It's a form of redress. It's pressing back, but it needs to also be a question. I know that's sort of a bit of it's kind of an ambiguous answer, but it's probably the right one.
Owen.
I think it's very much the right one. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's absolutely spot on. It's not an answer, but it's a response. And of course, you can respond with another question. I love this question. I was thrilled when I saw it come in because it speaks in a very true way to my experience of sort of being at the coalface of writing, because you do, or certainly I find, you know, that I will carry ideas of poems around with me for ages, you know, for months, sometimes years. And if they stick around, and if I'm pushed far enough to actually sit down and to try to make a shape of this feeling inside me in words, it's normally because there's a question. I feel like there's a question I want to explore. So I am in some way going in search of answers. But again and again, I seem to forget this every time I sit down. When you start writing a poem, or when I start writing a poem, I think I know what that question is. And the process of writing very often, normally if a poem works, reveals an entirely new question, a different question that I wasn't aware of when I started writing. And because the question changes, the subject of the poem changes. And I don't mean the subject of the action. So if this is a poem about horses, it's still a poem about horses. But I mean the subject of the meaning. That tends to change. And I think, you know, Robert Frost, the American poet, once said, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. And that's the kind of surprise that I suppose I wait for, which is when a poem suddenly speaks back to me, is having its own response and saying, you thought it was this simple question, but it's more complex than that, it's more nuanced, and actually, this is the question that you really wanted to ask. Do I ever reach an answer? I think the poem is the closest thing to an answer, and that's never complete. I think you always hope that a poem has kind of unspoken lines after the last line so that it continues. The last thing I'll say, though, in answer to this question, that there's another kind of writing I do where actually I very much do try and find answers through poetry, and that's, I don't know, maybe some people wouldn't call it poetry, but that's sort of a polemic, a long argument. So I've written a few pieces recently. I wrote a sort of a 30-minute piece around the concept of the reformation of our contemporary ideas of masculinity, of trying to blow open this very narrow bandwidth that we still have about what does it mean to be a man, and how damaging that narrow bandwidth is, obviously for women and girls, but also for men and boys. And I chose to write it as a long poem, or at least, you know, it was rhythmically driven, it rhymed, it was a close cousin of poetry. And I did the same for a BBC lecture a few years ago, which was about Wales and about Welsh identity. And I do that because when I write in that way, poetry for me is not just a form of language, but a form of thought and a system of thought. And I find it genuinely leads me to places intellectually that I wouldn't normally have gone. So in those examples, I'm not saying I always reach very good answers, but in those examples, yeah, sometimes poetry does actually lead me to answers.
There are a couple of great questions coming through the Q&A asking about sort of the technical side of your writing specifically, Owen. So I'll just read one out from Veronica, who asks, how much does Sheers think about his internal rhymes or soft alliterations which run through Skirrid Hill? Does the poem's subject suggest these itself? So does the subject matter suggest that you use those particular techniques, or how does it?
These are great questions. Yeah. You know, I've used the phrase lyric poetry a few times, and you know, as that phrase would suggest, for me, lyric poetry has its roots in music, and that doesn't have to mean writing in strict meter or certain forms. But for me, there are two kinds of music that I think every poet has. One is sort of the broader canvas of their song, you know, which is the music of their register, the poet's voice, a very slippery phrase, but one that I think is crucial to always consider. And then there's the individual melody or harmony, the tune of each poem, and very often for me that in a way will be arrived at via the subject. In that early draft, there will be lines that will set up a certain rhythm, a certain musicality. Sometimes, I'll be honest, I try to pull away from it, because one of the other things I love about Heaney is this poetry that is so closely related to the rhythms of everyday speech. So, you know, so often he'll open in the middle of a conversation, and it feels, you know, as Richard was saying, it feels like a pub conversation, and yet it's a great poem. And personally, sometimes I worry that, you know, if you let yourself be led too far by the music, you can travel too far from that. So yeah, the short answer is that yes, the subjects, that question that I'm exploring, the visual imagery will sometimes affect the alliteration, the assonance. And in terms of rhyme, I suppose sometimes those internal rhymes will have been end rhymes, but I tend to want to move towards a place where a rhyme is sensed rather than known, so it's not at the forefront of the poem, and so that will be sort of part of the craft in a second or a third draft, which I suppose is related to what I was just talking about maybe pulling a poem closer into the orbit of everyday speech by just burying some of those rhymes a little bit deeper.
And there's another fabulous question here. Would you say that love dominates your collection?
In terms of Skirrid Hill? That's a great question. Because you could argue that, you know, it's most obviously apparent in the relationship poems, which, as I said, because of that decade that these poems are sort of scanning over, tends to be love and the end of love, or the end of relationships, certainly. But then actually there are poems in there about grandparents and family members, which I would also put under the umbrella of love. So I wouldn't say it dominates. I hope it doesn't dominate. This is going to sound like a very woolly answer, but God, you hope that there's some braiding of love for your fellow human beings, for nature, for the world, for being here for the short amount of time that we are, that runs through every poem. So yeah, I'm going to give a very broad answer to that one.
Fran, could I come in on the question of love?
Please do.
Well, not your love, Seamus's love. Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on this earlier, didn't you? That reading the two collections side by side, you're aware that Heaney's a bit older than your younger self. You said it earlier, didn't you? So, you know, he's married with a kid, you know, and it's interesting just to look at the way in which Seamus Heaney really pushes the boat out there with his love poems, doesn't he? Because he's saying to his wife, hey, I'm going to write a love poem in which I compare you to an otter or a skunk. Which one, you know, which one do you prefer? Yeah, so I mean, I think they're wonderful poems, aren't they? There's a bit of separation there, isn't there? Owen's a lot of breakup, well, some breakup poems, but the couple of the Heaney ones, you have him in the skunk, isn't it? He's in California, the scent of eucalyptus. Well, it's actually interesting with memory because he's back with his wife, remembering when he was apart, seeing a skunk with its tail up, and then he sees his wife in the present, rooting around in the bedside drawer for some sexy nightwear, I have to say. Let me just let me find
that wonderful phrase, sootful, I think.
Sootful, yeah, I think that's a neologism, isn't it, or a near neologism? A very unusual word. I'd be interested to hear what you make of that. It's sootful. It's black. I'll just find the poem first before I start reading it. The otter and the skunk go together, don't they, in the volume? Yeah, that final stanza. I'll just read it out. It all came back to me last night. Yeah, so he's not in California. It all came back to me last night, stirred by the sootfall of your things at bedtime, your head down, tail up hunt in a bottom drawer for the black plunge line nightdress. So it's kind of comic erotic, isn't it? It's she's getting the plunge line nightdress out, but that's erotic, but it's sort of comic because she's sort of rooting around her underwear drawer, and the sort of sound of this, I don't know whether it's silky underwear, is soft like soot falling, but he's doing these kind of rather daring things in the Irish tradition. You know, he started the poem by thinking about the black of the skunk, like the chasuble at a funeral mass. So it's priestly garments. The priestly garment at the beginning of the poem becomes the erotic garment at the end. The white. So in other words, the risk has paid off because he's kind of justified the comparison of the erotic loved one, the wife, to a skunk, because it works in the poetic imagination. It reminds me of what the metaphysical poets sometimes do, which is yoke together the most disparate experience they have. It's like a challenge for the poet, right? I'm going to take something from that sphere of my knowledge and something from a diametrically opposed sphere, very different, and I'm going to, in the poem, I'm going to fuse the two together. So I'm going to take a real risk. It's far-fetched. It could fall flat on its feet, but I'm going to write a love poem to my wife in which she's a skunk.
Thank you. I've got another lovely question here to do with creativity. That's right. How do you deal? This is one for Owen. How do you deal with moments of spontaneous creativity or their opposite, writer's block? So both sides of the coin there.
Right. I refuse to acknowledge that writer's block exists. That's how I deal with this. Only because if I acknowledge its existence, I find that terrifying. No, of course, I think with poetry especially, I find that I kind of work through seasons, and I would love to be able to, divine exactly what brings these seasons about. But there will be quite long periods when when I will be working in other ways of writing and working on other projects. And there's something about the general kind of climate of life that isn't sort of lending itself towards thinking in the way that you need to think to start to approach poetry. And then the reverse is true. So I don't so much, though, think of that as writer's block, as kind of periods when you're unconsciously kind of filling the reserves. You know, if you are someone that writes about what happens, things have to happen for a period, and then they have to kind of distill sort of down deep enough into you, as I think it's a phrase of Heaney's when he talks about, you know, dropping the bucket down the well and drawing it up to see what's there. So I suppose the short answer to the question is I try not to worry. What's almost more disturbing is that when you start writing after a period away from poetry, and it is like running the tap, your muscles aren't in shape, and you're writing badly, frankly, but you have to do it because you kind of write yourself into the vein, I think. In terms of moments of sudden sort of inspiration or sort of thought and rhythm coming together, they tend to happen for me either through exercise, which is probably something as boring and as practical as, you know, a rush of oxygen to the brain, or through doing, you know, mundane tasks. And I think this has now been studied quite extensively, the concept of mind wandering, when you're doing something that is physically repetitive and it allows another part of your mind to wander. And again, I heard Heaney talk about this. He and his wife had a house outside of Dublin that he used to drive to for 2 days a week to go and do his writing. But he once said he actually did all the writing on the drive there and then spent the 2 days gardening, you know, because there's something about driving, that mechanical repetition, that allows you to write. And actually reading fieldwork, I noticed how often Heaney is opposed of driving and of having driven somewhere. And then you think of a later poem like Postscript and that wind coming at the car and so hitting it sideways. He's a poet of the car as well as he is a poet of nature and the land. So I tend to deal with those moments quite badly because I always think that these ideas and these lines, you know, they feel so alive, that they exist so strongly that there's no way that I could forget them. And often you do. So I've now learned to have somewhere within reach a notebook, or of course nowadays we have phones, so I do a lot of recording of lines onto my phone. And actually that's a great example where modern technology, I think, is a huge boon to a poet, because you're immediately recording it and you're hearing it at one and the same time. And for me, that means you're kind of jumping several steps down the line straight away.
And just quickly, as a postscript to that, I can see another question which is very much connected. Do you feel that travel has impacted on your writing? Do the current restrictions on travel also restrict creativity? So if you could just say a couple of sentences about that.
So very quickly, to answer the first part, yes, I think partly for the reasons I was just talking about, travel, I think, affects all writing, actually, even if you're not writing immediately about the travel or the place that you're going. And that's about, you know, changes of places, of people, of sounds, of languages. There's something that engages the brain. It's a very vitalizing experience, even if you don't write in the moment, even if you write after the moment. Traveling in a train, I've spoken to so many poets about this, is especially conducive to writing. And it's something about being stationary and moving at one and the same time. And again, it's one of those things I almost don't want to investigate too much because I just know that it works. But there's something fascinating going on there about stillness and movement, and being everywhere and nowhere at one and the same time. Has the limitations on travel affected creativity? Yes, in that it's reduced everything I've just spoken about or stopped it. But God, as so many people have spoken about, it's turned the volume up in other areas. I think what's interesting is that as a population, as a species, we're looking very differently closer to home. So it's been well recorded that people are noticing nature more, are hearing bird song. We've all had to enter these new relationships with the places that we live and the people that we live with, because we're with them all the time. And for me personally, that's been a huge spur. And through the first 6 months of lockdown, having gone through one of those seasons of not writing much poetry, suddenly I was writing lyric poems, which I think was partly about that different spur to creativity, but also about, as so many people did over that period, returning to the comfort of a familiar place, an old friend.
Fran, perhaps I could briefly mention fieldwork in response to this. A couple of points to pick up, if that's all right.
Yes, that would be great.
Yes, hearing Owen talking about his compositional procedures, he mentioned the kind of dipping of the well. It's interesting to read what Heaney said about the composition of fieldwork. I think it might be useful for students. He said that he deliberately set out to lengthen the line again because the narrow line was becoming a habit. And he mentions that in his previous volumes, North and Wintering Out, I'm quoting here, burrowing inwards, and those thin, small quatrain poems, they're kind of drills or augers. So that picks up a different sort of critical metaphor, kind of drilling down, narrow and deep. Auger, it's like water, like divination. You know, what will I find down there? So it's that kind of depth metaphor again. But this was for the previous volume, for turning in, and they're narrow and long and deep. Well, after those poems, says Heaney, I wanted, and this is where fieldwork comes in, I wanted to turn out, go out. I wanted to pitch the voice out. It was at once formal, but also emotional, a return to an opener voice. So that's the opened ground again. To a more, I don't want to say public, but a more social voice. And Owen was talking about the kind of the conversational rhythms. You know, there's obviously the linguistic density, but also that the voice that is still there and it's allowed. And actually, I think Heaney was trying to open up that social voice in his collection, which he does, doesn't he? So that's one thing about the voice, the conversational. It's interesting to kind of think about. Obviously, lockdown doesn't affect fieldwork, but in terms of travel movement, we can say something there. That I'm sure the A-level students have probably looked at these biographical contexts, which I tend to try to keep on the margins as much as possible. But it is useful to know that he left Belfast in 1972 and went to live in this cottage in County Wicklow for about 3 years. The Glanmore sonnets are about that time. So it's obvious to say, but he's crossed a political border there. He's making a statement there. He's moving from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, but it's a kind of retreat, which he takes a mickey out of himself, that it's like, oh, we're like Dorothy and William Wordsworth, you know, the strange loneliness I brought you to, and then the wife interrupts. He's very self-aware in that sense. But yeah, I suppose, he's setting up. I don't know whether it's the same place that Owen was talking about when he's driving in County Wicklow, that's south of Dublin. But I suppose he's reflecting, and then the volume comes out in '79. So he's subsequently moved to Dublin. So he's moved around a bit by the end of the '70s, and he's kind of going back into the storehouse of his memories. He's thinking about people who've died and many other things. Think about childhood, as Owen does. But having kind of recently moved, cross borders, yeah.
Mm.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just looking at the time, and we have really just a few minutes left before we start to wind our way to the end of the session. So I actually, just to take us in that direction, I've got a specific question for both of you, which is similar but not quite the same. For you, Richard, I'd like to ask what advice you've got for a young reader, so a teenage reader of poetry. And for you, Owen, I was wondering if you could wind up the session for us by offering some advice to the young poets who might be out there in the group today. So Richard, what's your advice to somebody who's maybe recently started reading poetry? Where might they like to go next? What else might they like to read by Heaney, perhaps?
Well, I just like to reflect on what it's like for people to read nowadays. It was easier for us who are not digital natives. We didn't have quite so many competing devices. We had the TV, of course, we had the radio, but I think there's been work done on this about attention span, and I feel it's harder for people now to read with the kind of affective intensity that often poetry requires. Everything is pushing you to click on your phone. I'm talking about myself here, to check the email. It's almost a kind of habit. You want to click on find out what's on the screen. So if it takes an effort, I would first say good reading is effortful, and it's not just passive consumption. And we have to give it its respect. You know, we have to sort of say, this could be tough. And I would just say, you know, that quite surprised me that this is on the A-level syllabus, because some of these poems are difficult. I found them really difficult, like field work. You know, that took, you know, the title poem, Unlocking the Mystery of Field Work. I think it's to do with the letter O. It's a vaccination mark. It's on the trunk. It's the coin in Moby Dick on the mast. It's the moon. It's the center of a sunflower, and it's back to the O on the arm. But I mean, it's not like that. You know, that took a bit of work, even if it might be completely way off. So I would say, just, you know, recognize that reading, to pay off and to be really rewarding, needs work in the best sense. The best sense, a good work, a deep work, you know, and that's reading and writing, of course it is. But you need to make the space to enter these imagined worlds. So that's a kind of woolly answer. Yeah, you mentioned about other Heaney poems. I better hurry up because we're running out of time. But yeah, I mean, there's loads of the work of Heaney that I don't know, particularly later on in his work. I mean, the first volume, Death of a Naturalist, is very, very well known and a wonderful opening collection, 1966. These fantastic poems of childhood, blackberry picking. I know Owen talked about on the podcast. The digging poem, his pen is his father's shovel, you know. So yeah, read through the Death of a Naturalist poems are fantastic. Personal Helicon, I think there's one with a well, isn't it? So and then you're aware that this kind of, when you made such a great start with these, I don't know, Wordsworthian poems of childhood, and then the troubles start in 68, 69, and people are saying, well, this is gifted poet and you need to do politics. And so thereafter, it's a constant, it's constantly this kind of oscillation between writing as somebody sympathetic to nationalism, a Catholic, but not a terrorist, of course, writing as a universal poet as well. So you have, and I'll finish, the bog poems are great, where he's thinking about the corpses that were ritually inhumed. New word for me. You have exhumed, but actually you can have inhumed as well. Put in the peat bogs, perfectly preserved. And he goes to Jutland in Denmark for, you know, to see other of these corpses. You have the Tolland man and the Grabowl woman and things like that. So yeah, the bog poems, the Death of a Naturalist, and then thereafter the way in which he's trying to negotiate his vocation as a poet and his position as on kind of across the border, straddled between two cultures.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Richard. And Owen, just for us to finish off today, any advice for the young poets out there who might be in the audience thinking, I'd like to try this out, not just read it, but write it? Absolutely.
Well, I guess I start with so much of what Richard just said, actually, you know, because reading and writing, they are two sides of the same coin. I said that's what made me want to be a writer, and so much of what Richard has just said applies to writing too, especially about giving yourself a space that is away from the virtual world. You know, writing is a deep dive, and you can't make that deep dive if you're constantly surfacing to, you know, check TikTok or email or whatever else. And one of the best things you can do is to read widely. And yes, of course, read Heaney, read from the people who have really mastered their voices, but also read your contemporary poets, people who are just publishing their first books now, because they're writing very much about our world, about your world. So make sure that you spread your reading net widely. But then also, almost in answer to that, as much as you can, write as yourself, have confidence in your voice. You know, every generation of poets has a chance to make the world anew again, and they have access to write about things that the poets before them just didn't. You know, so all of you out there will have access to stories, to elements of experience that I no longer do, and that is precious. That it's rich material, especially at your age. You know, Dylan Thomas drew for most of his writing life upon the notebooks he made as a teenager. It's an extraordinary time of life when sometimes I think it can feel as though your creativity is never ending. Hopefully that will be the case, but I can tell you now, as you get older, it's not always there. So mine these extraordinary years that you're in. A couple of other just quick pieces of advice. If you can, find some honest readers of your work. And by honest, I mean people who appreciate what you're trying to do, which might be a completely different kind of writing to what they do, but they'll judge you against the best of your work, but who will be honest. The worst thing any writer can have is someone who is giving them false praise and saying, that's wonderful, that's great. You need someone who is bold enough and kind enough to say, I love this piece. This part, to use a phrase of Heaney's again, has got the veins bulging in the biro. It's trying too hard. So go back and, you know, and redraft. And lastly, your best editing tool is time. So I'm working on the draft of a poem at the moment. Every time I finish a draft, I think that's it, it's done. I leave it for 2 days, I go back. I can see all of the weak hinges. I can see where it isn't quite the right word, where the rhythm isn't quite right. And that process will sometimes continue through 10, 11, 12 drafts, but it's not arduous. If you approach it in the right spirit, it can be a process of real joy as you're gradually moving towards a piece of writing that there'll be this day when you step back at it, having been away from it for like 4 or 5 weeks, maybe, you'll read it and you'll say, yes, that's there, it's finished. And if it's really worked, it'll feel as though it's always existed. And enjoy it.
Oh, that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you, Owen, so much, and Richard. Thank you both for such a fantastic conversation. It's been such a pleasure just sitting here listening to you. And thank you to our students and our audience out there who sent some really great questions, and we hope that you enjoyed hearing the answers. We unfortunately have to finish the event now, but as we say, it is going to be put online. There'll be podcasts and additional information sent your way. So hopefully we'll see you at the next event, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Fran.
Yeah.
Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.